We're at the world headquarters of the United Pentecostal Church International in Weldon Spring, Missouri, USA. It's a suburb of St. Louis. I'm David Bernard, the General Superintendent of the UPCI. We have about 42,000 churches worldwide in 195 nations and 35 territories. Here in the U.S. and Canada, our home base, we're almost at 5,000, about 4,900 churches, preaching points, daughter works. And with me here in the studio is Ken Gurley, who is a leading pastor in our fellowship, has served in many leadership roles over the years, but he's in Pearland, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. So our purpose here today, I'd like to talk to you about the NACLC. That's the National Apostolic Christian Leadership Conference. I serve as the chairman, and we have two arms. The purpose of the NACLC is to try to engage our leaders in civic affairs, that is government, political officials, and have influence as the apostolic movement. And so let me just briefly tell you about our structure, and then we're going to talk together about what we're trying to accomplish. It's not a partisan endeavor. We're not going to promote political parties or candidates per se, but we are going to promote our views and our values, and we're trying to make a positive contribution to our society. So as I mentioned, I serve as the chairman, but we have two arms. The first one is the Action Network, and that is going to mobilize the districts of the UPCI to try to engage on the local and state level, and then from there, of course, to congresspersons, senators, and so on. And the director of the Action Network is David Tipton, who currently serves as the district superintendent of the Mississippi District. He's written a brand new book that I've read and recommend. It's a small book, easy to read, called Faith, Freedom, and Politics. And he tells how you can get involved on a local and state level. And so we're going to be asking him to make a presentation to our general board, to our district superintendents, to offer the expertise and the experience of the Mississippi District to help each district, each state, and eventually we hope to do this in Canada as well, how they can mobilize in their area to have a positive influence. And then the other arm is called the Alliance, and that is a grassroots network of individuals, churches, business owners who will bind together to create a national alliance, again, to promote our values and our views. And Ken Gurley is the director of the Alliance. So, Brother Gurley, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Alliance and some of the things that we hope to accomplish?
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Bernard. This has been a long-held dream of our General Superintendent and First Lady, to get more involved and let the apostolic voices unite and become entwined in such a way that we could speak with one voice. We believe that we're one in the faith. We share a like precious faith, a common salvation. But all too often, we're not speaking the same thing when it comes to being the salt and light of our nation and our nation's conscience. Down through time, the church has had a role to play where we've stood up and we've spoken. And it's a privilege to work with Brother Bernard and with Brother Tipton to ally ourselves and to unite the many, many different apostolic voices in our land to speak to the most pressing issues of our day. There's a lot of room for commonality without getting, as Brother Bernard said, partisan. There are a lot of things that we share. We share the same values. All of us want to see this apostolic message go from coast to coast and indeed around the world, but we also want to affect our world and make the change. I'm looking forward to this, and we're in the entry stages, taking our baby steps, as it were, but we're already seeing some tremendous things happen.
And one thing that might come to mind is people say, well, shouldn't we be focused on missions, on the kingdom of God? And certainly that's our priority. Our priority is always going to be the whole gospel to the whole world by the whole church. It's always going to be about winning souls, discipling people, advancing the kingdom of God, church planting, church growth. But that doesn't mean we have to ignore the world around us. We should be good citizens, and we have the opportunity in our nation to have a voice, and we should use that voice. We're a democracy. We have the opportunity to vote. We should vote. We should try to improve our city, our state, our nation in whatever way that we can. We know the ultimate solutions are not going to be political. They're going to be through Jesus Christ, through the millennial kingdom, and even here and now through conversions and people being transformed by the power of the gospel. But our society can either help or hinder the work of the church. So first of all, religious freedom is supremely important.
Absolutely.
Because if we don't have religious freedom, that could hinder the work of the church. And then second, we want to bless our society. We want to reach out to the whole person when you're trying to reach the spirit. But what if you deal with people who are struggling with family situations, struggling with the decision of abortion, struggling with lifestyles, addictions, criminal behavior? Well, society has an impact in all these ways. So as much as possible, we want to mold the society to make it more conducive to Christian values. And so we do have an active role. Brother Gurley, we just started this last fall. We got official endorsement with the UPCI, and we've already reached out to other apostolic organizations. So tell us some of the initial activities that we've already done.
Well, we've had some good success in starting to form the alliances with people that share our values and things that matter to our constituents. We recognize we're citizens of another world, another kingdom, but we're citizens here, and this is beginning in the United States, and this is where we're focusing. One of the issues that is paramount and it's important to us is down on the border security, and a sensible, reasonable immigration policy that is a blessing to our country and to all of our constituents. We've been down to the border. We toured all the border facilities and discovered there are a lot of apostolics that work in those facilities up and down the border. And they were really thrilled when we made the effort to go down there. That's one of the first things that we did, and it was a meaningful trip, and it resonated in the hearts of Spanish-speaking people across the United States who are apostolics, who we have something like 1,000 works, I believe, in the United States.
Yes.
Spanish-speaking.
Right, just with the UPCI, not to mention the Apostolic Assembly of the Faith in Christ Jesus, for example. We reached out to them, and they participated in the border trip. So I was very thankful because Brother Gurley and Brother Tipton both began to work some initial contacts. And lo and behold, we received a congressional level tour, the same tour that congresspersons receive, organized by the White House, and they invited leaders of the UPCI, and we invited leaders of the Apostolic Assembly and other leaders that we could get, and there were some non-apostolics who joined us, but it was very informative. And here's a good example of something that's non-partisan, but we have conservative moral values, and so people that might vote in different ways as far as political party, we could agree that somehow we've got to secure the border, somehow we've got to maintain our laws and our identity as a nation. But then at the same time, we are an immigrant nation. We've always had immigrants. We need more immigrants, but we need a legal process that helps in the right way. And so there are many people, whether Hispanic or non-Hispanic, whether Democrat or Republican, who would like to secure the borders, but also have a legal path to immigration. So we're working. I met, for example, in Washington, D.C. with Sam Rodriguez, who is the director or the president of the National Hispanic Conference. And he's a Christian. He's a conservative evangelical. And he said they're working on a plan that they could present to the administration and to Congress. And I said, well, we're very interested in looking at your plan because this might be something that we could work together on. So that's probably the first project that came to mind. And then also recently we were at the National Prayer Breakfast. Brother Tipton, Brother Gurley, and I all were invited to the National Prayer Breakfast last week in Washington, D.C. And that was the opportunity to meet a number of leaders. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
It was probably the most eventful week as far as D.C. is concerned in the last 25 years. A lot of things were happening there, a lot of cross currents. But what we saw, and we crossed paths with many senators, many congressmen, a lot of the leaders of major faith organizations. Focus on the Family was there as well. We met with them. And it gave us a chance. It gave us a chance out outside of the usual partisan gridlock in politics of D.C., to rub shoulders with the men and women who are serving our nation in one way or another, one office or another, and then also to have a chance to influence them or to reinforce the godly values that they already possess. It was very informative. It was at the prayer breakfast, one of our apostolic songs was sung, Sister Jo Strand's song, and it was, indeed, you could feel the presence of the Lord from that song that was sung. And it gave us a chance. Brother Bernard got to meet the local senator here, the junior senator of the state of Missouri.
Yeah, Josh Hawley, the state senator, or the U.S. senator from the state of Missouri. So I was able to explain to him our international headquarters is right here. I want you to know who we are, because from time to time we may have issues or needs, and we want to connect with you. So that was a very productive meeting. And then both Brother Gurley and I come from the state of Texas, so I particularly wanted to meet Senator Ted Cruz. We were able to meet in his office for about 20 minutes, talk about faith values, freedom of religion. I brought up the need for immigration reform. I underscored the position of pro-life legislation, which of course he's strongly for. And then Brother Tipton was able to arrange a meeting with the senator from Mississippi, Roger Wicker, the same type of things. And then I was particularly pleased that we were able to get an interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and we had about 20 minutes in his office as well. I wanted to emphasize the need for freedom of religion and the U.S. supporting values around the world, our democratic values and freedom of religion. And I also wanted to make a personal connection with his office because, as I mentioned, we have churches and believers and missionaries and official representatives in almost every nation of the world, 195 out of 210, and we're working on the last 15. Well, at any given time, there could be an international crisis, a terrorist attack, kidnapping, a war, an epidemic as in China, and we might have people in harm's way. We might need to take action fast. And if our government can help us, especially with our own citizens, well, that's the government's job, but we want to, so I told Secretary Pompeo, I would like someone on your staff that I could contact. If there's an international crisis, some of our people are in harm's way, American citizens, the government can act, I want to know. And there may be some situations where due to diplomacy, the government is limited in what it can or cannot do, but at least I want somebody to give me advice as what we as the church can do in those emergency situations. And so Secretary Pompeo said, I want you to have my personal cell number. And I said, well, I just need a staff member. He said, no. And of course, his number wasn't on his card, so he tore off a piece of paper and wrote it down. And he said, I may not answer immediately, but if you text or call this number, I promise you I will respond personally. Well, in a way, I hope I never have to use that number because it would probably mean there's some emergency or crisis. But it is very comforting. And I told Bruce Howell, the General Director of Global Missions, about this because if there ever would be a crisis or an incident or a need for consulting with our government about what's the proper course of action, it's really great to know that we have friends in high places. And I think that's a legitimate purpose. In the Old Testament, you see examples like Esther and Daniel and Joseph. These were people of God who did not compromise their faith, did not compromise their lifestyle, but yet they had influence in high places, and they used that influence to help the people of God and help the will of God. And we're not talking about using the government to try to promote our religion. That's not what we want. We want a separation of church and state. But we just want to know that when decisions are made or when problems arise, we are not ignored, but we're considered. That's what needs to happen.
I was struck too, Brother Bernard. Of course, the UPCI is a global organization, so that contact with Secretary Pompeo was huge. But I was struck as well what a plain spoken, kind man he was. Owned machine shops in Kansas, here in Missouri, down in Texas, was motivated to get involved in politics, run for office 10 years ago, and now he's the Secretary of State. And he he spoke to us about how important faith is in the State Department, that he has opened the doors to faith to come in. Religious leaders from all over the United States and the world are coming into the State Department because he wants to accentuate that religious freedom is a part of who we are as a people, that our people should be able to worship freely no matter where they are. And having constituents in so many oppressed nations of the world, and one of our largest groups is in Venezuela, and the turmoil that's been going on there, it grieves the hearts of every apostolic person around the world to see this happen. But to watch someone who is so proactive and so interested in the apostolic faith and so complimentary, that we were reaching out trying to get involved, not in a sense that we're trying to influence their policies or decisions or get people in their offices, although I was struck too, Brother Bernard, how many apostolics are all across Capitol Hill.
In various positions, yes. And again, some people might say, well, isn't this just a partisan thing in disguise? Not really. As we travel across the country, I have many opportunities to meet officials, such as when we have like anniversary services, where you'll have a mayor or even a congressman or congresswoman come. I remember when we had our general conference in Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee, who's a Democratic congresswoman, came to the conference, greeted us. We took pictures with her. We made a connection with her. Just this last week, we not only met with some Republicans, but we met with a legislative council for a Democratic congresswoman. And when I was in Brooklyn, New York, Pastor Mike Mitchell's church, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke was in attendance. She attends that church on a regular basis. And so we're trying to make contacts with both Democrats and Republicans. Why? Number one, we want to have positive influence. And there are many of our issues that are not specifically partisan, but reflect moral values. And we want to have influence on both sides of the aisle. Second, we want the church to be respected. So when it comes to religious freedom, when it comes to, as I mentioned, international situation, if it comes to have some politicians have already said, let's take away the tax exempt status of churches. Well, we want, whether someone's Democrat or Republican, we want them to hear our voice on that issue. So by the way, Brother Tipton and I went to the National Prayer Breakfast under President Obama. So this is not the first time that we've done something like that. And the last 2 years, my wife and I have been invited to Governor Greg Abbott's Christmas reception. We've been able to make a personal connection with Governor and Mrs. Abbott. So I think all of these, at the end of the day, they're people like us. We want to have influence. And also, we are interested in them as people. And we want them to know we are people too. Because what I've found, many times Pentecostals have never participated. And so the only thing politicians know about Pentecostals, they're those strange people, or they're people that dress differently, or don't they handle snakes? And some of the comments that politicians have made recently to friends of ours, not to us directly, but something like, well, that's amazing. Where have the Pentecostals been all this time? Or, they're really nice people. They're great people. We should have got to know them before. So you eliminate these negative stereotypes. And of course, different ones of our ministers have done this over the years. It's well known that Pastor Anthony Mangan in Alexandria, Louisiana was and still is a longtime friend of President Bill Clinton, going back to days in Arkansas. And so I think it shatters stereotypes, and it helps us to put a face on real peoples. And I'll give you one other example. When I was at the governor's reception last year, Karl Rove was there. He was a very prominent political operative under George W. Bush, helped him get elected, and he still is a consultant and a news contributor. And so I just went up, introduced myself, said who I was, and immediately said, I want to tell you what was striking to me when I met the Pentecostals. He said, I arranged a meeting for President Bush with a group of Pentecostal leaders. When we walked in the room, we were expecting all white men. But he says it was interracial more than any other group we've dealt with, black and white. He said the Pentecostals do a better job of being multiracial and representing everyone than any other group. Well, that's a positive witness.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But for that to happen, we've got to be there.
That's right.
And so that's what we're trying to do. maybe you can tell us some other things we're working
Well,
on.
one of the things we're working on, and I'm up here this week for, and is we are trying to ally with a legal defense group for all of our churches and our ministers. This is the group that has defended apostolics in the past when they've taken a stand for their faith. And this is a time when all apostolics need to come together. When we have a Naaman's maid who will open her mouth in a strange land and speak the mighty things of God. And when they're attacked and their free speech is attacked and their right to worship is attacked, this is when all apostolics, and there are groups out there right now that have so courageously and fearlessly and sacrificially, to the tune of millions of dollars, provided defense for people of our faith who have stood. So we're meeting with them tomorrow to form a greater bonds with them, because we feel like it's something that our churches need all across the apostolic spectrum. Pulling together as well, Brother Bernard, you said the multicultural aspect of it. The apostolic organizations in the United States are exceedingly multicultural, come from diverse backgrounds, and we're enjoying, of course, this began at Urshan, back when Brother Bernard was president of Urshan. They started assembling the leaders of the 7 major apostolic organizations, and that has continued on now for a dozen years or so. And so we're building on those alliances that have been formed to not to try to coerce and persuade, but to try to share in our apostolic faith, because we believe that supersedes any political belief or any political stripe, that who we are as a people, it's very important, and our apostolic identity is important. Anything we can do to strengthen one another and strengthen each other, that is important to us.
Yeah, and so let me tag onto that. Urshan Graduate School of Theology, as you mentioned, in 2006 we started this meeting of apostolic leaders, which continues. And so I approached them about this plan for the NACLC, and I said, if you're interested, we'd like for you to participate. As we form our board, we'd like for you to recommend someone from your organization that could serve on the board. Because again, we don't want it to be a narrow partisan issue. We don't want it to be just one culture or black issue or white issue or Hispanic issue. We want common ground. And if you think about it, in the U.S. and Canada, our home base, the UPCI probably has on a good Sunday 600,000 attendance, probably at least conservatively 800,000 in its constituency. So if you compare to other organizations, denominations, what they call their membership or their constituents far exceeds their average Sunday attendance. So we could even be closer to 1 million if you use the same type of counting that, say, the Southern Baptists or the Catholics use. And if you look at the other apostolic organizations that are part of the fellowship, that's probably another 1 million. And then if you look at the independent groups, the independent churches, the small groups, some other groups that aren't part of the fellowship, the summit, that's easily another 1 million, maybe even double. So you're talking about conservative 3 or 4 million apostolics. So we deserve to be heard, and people want to hear what we have to say. And so you might be asking, well, what specifically can we do? If there's so much diversity, what would you agree on? Well, first of all, I think we can agree we need to register voters, because our church people are underrepresented in voting. So we've got to get them out to vote. We're not going to tell them who to vote for. We're going to tell them to vote for moral values. But we need voter registration. We need to get out the vote. We need voter education. Here's the issues that are of interest to us. You ought to be checking out different politicians, whether locally or nationally. What do they stand for at various levels? So that's something we can do to engage our own people in the process. And we've already mentioned working on immigration reform. We've already mentioned religious freedom, but let me explain. The Mississippi district of the UPCI has taken the forefront in some of these things. Brother Tipton is not here this time. Maybe one of these times when he's in town, we can tag in with him as well. But in Mississippi, we have Tupelo Children's Mansion and New Beginnings Adoption Agency. Well, those type of institutions are often highly regulated by state government. and promoting very liberal secular values, such as if you're going to have an adoption agency, you must adopt homosexual couples. So Mississippi has long engaged their state and congressional officials to protect the religious liberty of our own institutions, and they've been successful in doing so. So building on that, they also were instrumental. In fact, I think it's fair to say that had it not been for the influence of the United Pentecostal Church, the religious freedom bill that Mississippi recently passed would have failed. But it protects business owners and professionals from being forced to violate their sincerely held religious beliefs in speech that they would disapprove of. For instance, now we believe you shouldn't discriminate against people as far as if you have a business, you have a restaurant, or everybody's welcome. So certainly every race, but even people with lifestyles that we don't approve of, whether they're living in fornication or adultery or divorced and remarried against God's will, or homosexuality or transgender, whatever, everybody should have the opportunity to exercise the rights of citizenship and shop and go to restaurants and whatever. But what happens when someone is coerced to, say, do a cake that has a congratulations for a same-sex marriage? Or what if somebody's asked to provide a barbecue for the Ku Klux Klan? Well, we ought to have a right to say, I will serve everybody. But if you're asking me to endorse a political viewpoint or a moral viewpoint that I'm opposed to, then I should not be forced. I can accommodate you by introducing you to someone who is willing to do that. Well, that's religious freedom, and that's what Mississippi just passed, and the UPCI was instrumental in making sure that got passed. Another thing that Brother Tipton is working on right now that's going to probably become something that the various organizations and the NACLC will officially do is a donor protection law. So what happens is you donate to causes, especially for moral values, and then people try to persecute everyone who's donated. And so that would restrict your freedom of speech and freedom of religion and your freedom of assembly if you can be targeted and attacked just because you're trying to express your religious views or your moral views. And as I mentioned, tax-exempt status, if that comes under attack for churches, then we're all going to be interested in that. But I was just thinking, and there could be many issues of religious freedom that who knows what's going to come up in the next few years. But another thing that Mississippi did, it's a very interesting backstory, but Mississippi did criminal justice reform. So for nonviolent criminals of many years ago, and maybe their offense was a drug offense, they've been rehabilitated, but they have these extremely long sentences. And that disproportionately affects minority communities, such as African Americans. Well, in Mississippi, the UPCI was instrumental in doing criminal justice reform, which is part of our values. If someone is truly repentant, they've been converted, maybe in our own jail ministry, they've done their time for many years, they're not a threat to society, they should get a second chance under certain circumstances. Now, we're going to be conservative when it comes to law and order protecting our communities, but we want to have Christian values. And so there is a path for criminal justice reform. So Brother Tipton and the Mississippi District was successful in implementing that in Mississippi. So guess what? President Trump expressed a great interest, and you know that he recently got that passed on a national level as a bipartisan legislation, and of course he's promoting that as a key accomplishment of his administration. But he went to Mississippi to find out how they did it there. And the governor of Mississippi said, well, you need David Tipton and his team in the room to tell you how to do it. And so here is a way where it's not reported in the news, but the United Pentecostal Church was able to significantly influence national legislation in a bipartisan way. And so that's what the NACLC is wanting to do. So we want to build on the success of Brother Tipton in Mississippi, share that with other districts, so that all across the nation we have an engaged church that's making a difference in our community. And that will, our goal is, first of all, to protect our own religious freedom and freedom to preach the gospel, but at the same time to better our community. But if we do that as good citizens, then people will look to us, even people that might be skeptical of religion, instead of saying, well, you're bigoted, you're full of hatred, you're this, you're that, and they will say, your church is really engaged in helping our community. We thought you would be this ultra-conservative, hate-filled person. Instead, you're working to do things that we all appreciate. And that may give us more space for respect and freedom of religion when people realize what we're really trying to accomplish. So we're kind of coming close to our time here, but I mentioned several things that we're working on or could work on. So, maybe any last thoughts, Brother Gurley, or maybe tell the average person, maybe an average pastor or even a local church member. As I mentioned, Brother Tipton on the action side is going to be meeting with district superintendents to say how can districts get involved. So if you're a district superintendent or a district leader, you'll get more information on that. But if you're just the average pastor or the average church member, saint of God, and you're interested, you want to get involved in some way, you want your voice to be heard, you've got ideas for us, or you want to support what we're doing, Brother Gurley, tell us what we can do.
Thank you, Brother Bernard. What we will be doing on the Alliance side is trying to ally all of these several million voices and the organizations to pull together to speak with one voice in different issues. We'll be having newsletters go out with information, what's happening in the latest thing. We'll be having meetings in D.C. that you're free to be a part of. And I think it will be a blessing. Here's something that it struck me when Brother Bernard was speaking, and I think we fall on this so many times. We believe it's either or. Either we're spiritual or we work with people. And I don't believe this is an either or. This is the genius of an and. We can pray, and we know that the gospel message works, and we know the power of prayer. And that will always be our preeminent effort. Just as Nehemiah built with a sword and a trowel, we're always going to have that spiritual element out front. But there should also be something else that we're working practically behind the scenes, like Brother Tipton is doing. So practical. Every district will have liaisons to work with that. But what you can do to get involved is you can support these efforts. We'll be having meetings, and as this begins to evolve and grow, we will be getting more and more involved with different elements and getting more of you involved. There is room for your involvement. You say, how do I get involved? Well, you can go to the website, that's NACLC.org, National Apostolic Christian Leadership Conference, NACLC.org. You can sign up there, we can get your information, and we'll start sharing our newsletter with you. And as we begin to move into this pivotal season, not where we pull a lever for a Republican or Democrat, but where the church stands up and assumes its God-given destiny and identity as the salt and light of the earth, you have a pivotal role to play. Join us, NACLC.org.
And I'll just say this too, I think you can contribute as well if you go on the website, because my wife and I have contributed already, because we believe in what we're talking about. We do want you to vote, and we do want you to vote your moral convictions, but we trust you as the people of God. You will prayerfully consider all options, and you will do what you think is best for our nation. So we want you to pray, we want you to vote, we want you to go on the website, naclc.org, and sign up to start getting information. We want you to come to meetings when they're announced. We want you to contribute. So there's a few things you can do. Thank you.
Thank you.